and welcome everybody back. Just for a little bit of a review in our survey class that we've been conducting, we started with the quandary, what the heck is a Jew anyway? Tonight, you'll get a little bit more of an insight into where we've been and just how complicated the question is due to that very fact that we've traveled everywhere and been everywhere. And last week we looked at ancient Israel, and we got right up to where I was hoping to get, to 586 BCE, which was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the beginning of the Babylonian exile. So when you hear most people talk about the diaspora, which is the word for the far-flung, that always sounds like a Yiddish word to me, far-flung, the far-flung Jewish people's residency across the world, we usually do not begin it in 586 BCE, because the mythos of the Jewish people is that, yes, we went into exile in 586 BCE, but some 70 or 80 years later, all returned back to the land of Israel and remained there in good company until those terrible Roman wars, which we'll discuss tonight, and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, in other words, on our side of the divide. And at that point, the Romans expelled the Jews and the diaspora began. But that is a childish and very, very inaccurate telling of history. So when I talk about the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews, I not only begin it in 586 BCE, because that really is when the first major, really the first of any kinds of non-Eretz Yisrael, non-land of Israel based Jewish community began, but I also include Israel in the diaspora. I include Israel as part of the dispersion, because while Israel is seen in many ways as the center, and it was, part of the reason that historically we look back on it being the center is because we lost all connection to what was happening in the other far-flung communities. And I'll hopefully touch on that briefly tonight. So if you're talking about a dispersed people, we're simply dispersed everywhere. And we've been that way. And we've brought in new people over time. To the extent that I'll be able to touch on that tonight, I will. One of Sherwin Wine's descriptions of the Jewish people was to describe us as a world people. And he was extremely right on this count. We have lived as a people outside of Israel much, much longer and in far greater numbers than we ever lived inside the land of Israel. But as I mentioned, even inside at some point becomes part of that dispersion. Doesn't take away the fact that it's also a center. But when you think about American Jewish life today, we're a center too. You can't discard almost half of the world's Jewish population, or at least a good third, over a third being here. And so Israel at that time, we have to view as one of many communities, or one of several communities, some of which we know a lot about and some of which we don't. But we're going to rewind the tape for a moment. And as I discussed just moments ago, we're going to visit the Babylonian exile. So just to rewind a couple of hundred years, not even that many hundreds of years earlier, for just a moment, you'll remember that the northern kingdom, known as Israel, was destroyed in 722 BCE. The damage to the southern kingdom of Judah was not inconsiderate. In fact, all that survived was Jerusalem. It was a larger Jerusalem because so many refugees from the north had come down there. But when we talk, as historians talk, about the southern kingdom of Judah in the post-exilic age, or I'm sorry, in the post-Assyrian conquest age, what they're talking about is primarily Jerusalem. In the period between 722 and 586, there were a few communities that reestablished themselves around Jerusalem, but that was basically it. And so that kingdom went on as it did. And if you're interested in learning more about what the Bible and archaeology says about that, that's the subject of our Saturday morning classes, where we're making our way through all the Bible right now, along with archaeological testimonies. But what I will tell you is that it also faced serious enemies beyond the Assyrians. And the primary one that it had to deal with once the Assyrians were out of the picture were the Babylonians. And it was in 597 BCE that Nebuchadnezzar, coming over from Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Iraq, if you want to use modern day maps, set his sights upon the destruction of, or the occupation of Jerusalem and what else was left of Judah. In 586 BCE, the process of taking over was complete. He had to deal with a lot of revolts. It wasn't the first thing on his agenda. He tried to put in some puppet kings. Ultimately, that didn't work. And in 586, he deported some number, but not the majority. Some large number, though, perhaps in the tens of thousands, we will never know, of Jews from Judah, from Jerusalem, into Babylon. So who were they? Well, they were primarily the priests, the royal family, the elite, other kinds of leaders, perhaps the people who were in business, as it were, those kinds of things. That community, that diaspora, very first diaspora community in Babylon, in the city of Babylon, where they were kept by Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, was, until some of your lifetimes in the 1940s and 50s, the oldest Jewish community of continuous habitation on earth, which tells you something. Most of them never went back to Israel. And though they had the opportunity, most decided not to. And so there, from Babylon and moving into Persia, current Iran, Jewish culture was built both in partnership with what was going on in Israel, but also independently. And in fact, later on, not right now, we'll hear about some of what they produced, notably, just to plant it in your brains, the Talmud that we talk about so often. Though there was one version that came out of Israel, it was small, is generally known to us as, in Hebrew, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, because most of it is a product of Babylon, though that would be much, much, much later, approximately 700-800 years after the period we're talking about. So jumping back to the Babylonian exile, as I mentioned, all of these people left. Most of them did not come back, and most of the people who were in Judah never left. The Jews who were in Jerusalem tended to stay. So why did Babylon become so important? Well, on one hand, look at the kinds of people that they were taking. It was everybody of any kind of cultural or social import. Weirdly, for reasons that we don't entirely understand, except that it was the Babylonian custom, unlike what the Assyrians had done, which was to simply exile and crush, and then replant new people in place, that wasn't the Babylonians' idea. They were more globalists. They wanted to appreciate the cultures of the people that they occupied. They wanted those connections for trade, for other reasons. It's not my field, but I have a feeling that may be, that perhaps it was the desire for more trade routes and friendly faces in different parts of their empire that they did this. At any rate, it meant that the Jews were essentially settled in one area. So there was a Jewish neighborhood, so to speak. And in fact, we know that that by now it was a puppet king, but it was in the dynasty. The king was settled in a palace there. Eventually, we lost track of the royal family there, though hundreds of years later, and actually hundreds and hundreds of years later, there was a system that was in place for that community of being ruled by an exilarch. And those people always claimed to be the descendants of the Davidic dynasty. But at any rate, while they were there during the 70-year intensive period, they certainly were intact. Not only were they intact, but Prophets came over as well. There were some very famous prophets who prophesied there. One in particular named Ezekiel, he's one of the big ones because he wrote so much, he was prone to some really wild visions of God and everything else, but he was the prophet also of great hope for return. If you've ever heard the dry bones story, where he talks about a dream that God gives him, Yahweh gives him, where he speaks to bones and the bones come together, and the bones are supposed to be the people of Israel. Later on, much of what Ezekiel, along with others, spoke about during these particularly weird, difficult, and fruitful years would use his writings and others as the basis for the messianic dream, the messianic hope of the Jewish people that we will address at some point. Not only that, but the priests who were there, including their scribes and other schools of groups, people, I guess, who now were leaning on each other in the wake of this relocation, this forced relocation, they began to work on their texts. I always have this image of this like large cart of texts being brought into Babylon, and I don't think it's terribly far from the truth. We don't know of the Torah as we know it today before the Babylonian exile. We don't know of the histories of the kingdoms as we know of them today before the Babylonian exile. Because it's a survey class, getting into the weeds with so much of what the different schools and so forth were that were there, I can tell you that they must have come to some accommodation with each other, because what were competing texts that actually contradict each other. I'll give you one little example. The two stories of the book of creation, of the book of Genesis about creation. You have the majestic one, right? Where God creates the world in 7 days. It's very cosmic. It's very looking down on the universe. And then you have that anthropomorphic one with talking snakes and God, Yahweh, walking around the jungle and, making people out of clay, and not simply speaking as the first story is. But the first story, which is newer, by the way, the first story is the newer story. The second story is the older story. They were competing tales. The original writers didn't agree with each other on stuff, but somehow, whoever their descendants were, they pieced all this together into what became the one text of the Torah. And they seem to have put together the rest of the historical texts, both at that time and we believe afterwards too. There are some biblical scholars, they're increasingly taken less seriously, let's put it that way, discredited, I was going to say, who believe that the whole thing, everything the Jews ever wrote, was done in the 4th century, and it was all phony baloney nonsense. But while the archaeology certainly didn't prove most things, it didn't disprove it to that extent. We found the names of kings, we found the names of a lot of these people, and there's other reasons, and many of them that we believe that they were real. But the stories aren't necessarily true about them. They're written from the perspective of the people who now have inherited this tradition. So they sewed all these texts together in a brilliant way. Some of our holidays seem to have been inspired by, or even stolen directly, or with a few little changes, from the people of the Mesopotamian and Persian world. I can't get into too many, but some of the fast days, but two that you wouldn't believe, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I talked about that on Rosh Hashanah when I spoke about the evolution of these days. Other big things happened, though, in Babylon during the 70, 80 years that they were intensely there before there was any sign or promise that they could ever leave, and no expectation really other than hopeful that they would. Monotheism seems to have been sealed there. So what do I mean by that? The Bible gives us all kinds of breadcrumbs and overt and covert hints, and more than that, that the Israelites were never big monotheists. But there does seem to have been a time towards the end of the beginning of the 7th century, that is the 620s, 630s, when henotheism or monolatry, take your pick. It's the idea that there's one God that's more powerful than the others, but you don't necessarily lose your belief in the other gods, when that took hold. In Babylon, it seems to have intensified. Now, this nonsense, and I say this as a humanistic Jew, so this is my editorializing, this nonsense that all monotheists believe in only one God alone, is belied by the fact that they always seem to have plenty of others who will intercede, who will do magic, who have all kinds of miraculous abilities and so forth. But be that as it may, I'm going to go ahead and give them credit for being as purely monotheistic as possible. Probably the Muslims are the closest to truly get there. But if that happened, and if we can truly call something purely monotheistic, it seems to have been a result of the Jewish exile in Babylon. And part of that seems to have been related as well to another new idea about God. This one really may be genuinely new. Not only was God seen as the creator of all things, the king of the universe, etc., who also happened to love the Jews extra special, so yay for us. The internal contradictions there, I won't even begin to touch upon. Theologians have spent thousands of years trying to figure it out, and as an atheist, I don't have to, so that's good. But one of the things that they did invent at that time was the idea of a portable God. God followed them into the exile. And so God was worshipable there. Not just one among many, not just your God, but you also need to pay attention to the Babylonian gods, but you can just pray to your own God. And so this portability of God also seems to have spun out some new institutions. One of them, and this is again, it's a little bit speculative, but we found increasing evidence in the last 30 years that the synagogue was invented in Babylon. In other words, a substitute for a temple. Temple is where you make sacrifices to God. One of the reasons our place is so inappropriately named is that the Reformed Jews, the reason they started calling everything temple in English when nobody had ever done that before is because their point in using the word temple was that it was a house of sacrifice of the heart to God. That's why you see so many more Reform organizations named temple than conservative. All right, that's a digression, but I always put it in there. Self-blame, guilt and self-blame becomes a very big motif of the Judaism of Babylon. And the reason is that they they strongly feel that they were put there to punish them for all the reasons that are outlined in the works of the prophets who came along just before they were put there. Now, why would these people have said, you're going to, if you don't become better, be exiled? And then they were exiled, and then they all could go, I told you so. Well, it was because of what was behind them in Israel. Israel had been destroyed, completely and utterly destroyed. A lot of these prophets were from the north, and they started the school of self-blame. But you know, you don't really believe something's real until you're there, unless it's COVID, and then apparently you never believe it's real. But they wind up in Babylon, and they start to realize that their prophets were telling them the truth, or at least they began to believe it was the truth. And another big feature, another new invention, in addition to the holidays and the new texts or the new editions of the text, the newly edited versions of the text, and the new traditions, was a beginning of seeing themselves as a nationality without national boundaries, an ethnicization, if you will, or maybe a self-racialization. It's very difficult for us to put modern sociological terms to these, but these were certainly different these were ideas that were certainly different than when they had lived in Judah and Israel, where, like any nation, at least at the time, if you moved to a place and you accepted their gods, you were one of them. That seems to have disappeared. And that probably was coterminous with this idea of the great God of the universe, who especially loves us. And now I'm not saying it in a kind of a sarcastic way, but it has chosen us. And so why would this God choose us? Because there's something innately special about us. And that goes on and on and on and on throughout history. I read on the daily, I read Reform rabbis even saying things like this, although you find other ways of describing chosenness that are a little bit less, let's put it this way, disregarding of others. This is a 1 hour lecture that doesn't belong in a survey course, but the concept of chosenness was probably one of the worst things they brought back from Babylon. And yet it may have had a lot to do with keeping the Jews together. So who knows? We can never completely rewind that. What was going on back home in the old country in the meantime during these 70 or so years? Well, they were not the recipients of all this new jazzy stuff over the last 70, 80, and it would go on for a few more decades as well. In fact, another 5 or 6 decades, because even after the return, most people didn't come back ever, but more people came back 150 years later. So what were they doing back home? Well, apparently it was rough. There was famine, there was dealing with the Babylonians who didn't respect them. But in the year 538, the Babylonians now having been conquered by the Persians, King Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Great, issued the decree of return, the Edict of Return for the Jews. Now, we don't have any copy of this in any kind of extra biblical source, but we do know he did this for other peoples, and we have references to the Jews in other places in the Persian extra biblical record, and so it's expected that there could be no other reason for this. They went back. He let them go back. He said they could build their temple, and so about 70 years later, they do go back. It's a long haul. It's rough. They are not sharing the cultural paradigm that the other Jews who are returning from Babylon are. And it gets worse. The community starts really unraveling until about 60 years after that, when two gentlemen who share the name of one book in the Bible called they share the name of two books in the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah, but it was originally one book. Ezra the priest and Nehemiah, a general or a leader of men and women, they come back, and he's the one who brings all the texts and introduces them to this new way of life. Now, we don't know that he's the one who came back with, for sure, a finished Torah and a finished, at least parts of the Bible as we have them, but we suspect he came back with a lot, because the Bible itself records in his own story many of the things he was introducing them to for the first time, or things that they had forgotten about because they were leaderless. It's always difficult for us to tease out what they had never heard before or what was being brought back to them completely new. But my suspicion is that more of it was new than being returned. What was Ezra's goal? Well, he and Nehemiah and Nehemiah decided that they were going to make Israel again. I almost said make Israel great again, but I didn't go there. They were MAGAs, not MAGAs. And he had a very difficult task ahead of him. He needed to reform and reformulate this community, which was actually larger than what he had left behind back in Babylon, and to turn them into Jews like were living in Babylon, with all of their brand new ways of doing things and their brand new fancy books and holidays and everything else. In many cases, telling them that this was a restoration. And again, very difficult for us to know exactly what is a restoration and what is more something brand new. But we do have some hints, and that again would be for a more intense class. We could talk about some of those. One of the things he does as part of this sort of magical thinking about the chosenness or the racialization or ethnicization or nationalization or whatever you want to call it, again, I don't have a word for it, of the Jews, is that he gets there and he finds that the Jews have diluted themselves. And how do we know that? Because he talks about their foreign wives and their children. They've started to take on the ways of the non-Jews of the land, who were plentiful. They were all over the place. First of all, the Assyrians had brought in tons of them, and they were just all over the land. And he's met with opposition to this. We know this because somebody attacks him with a storybook. And one of my favorite stories about the return to Israel of the Babylonian Jews and Ezra's, what we would call today, racist command that they put away their wives, get rid of them, and any children they had by them, is that somebody else wrote a little novella. You know it because it's famous. We actually read it in Jewish circles to this day on Shavuot, which is the holiday of getting the Torah in traditional Judaism. It's called the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is about a Moabite who goes with her mother-in-law after a series of tragedies. Her mother has to return to Israel from Moab, and she says, I'll go with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Just like that, she becomes an Israelite. And she's also, in the big surprise ending of the book, she's revealed to be the great ancestress of none other than King David. So whoever wrote that story, which is 1,000% fictional, and which in the Christian Bible comes as if it were part of the narrative of the kings and all of that, but in the Jewish Bible it's put elsewhere in the writings. Whoever wrote that wrote it as a protest text. So clearly, if we have that protest text, there were probably others too, but they're hidden in history. We just do not have enough information about the entirety of the experience of those who came back and those who never left in order to understand what was new, what was revived, and what was just stuff they were making up. I have no idea. My computer just decided to put me into a, did that happen to you? Did you see that? Okay. All of a sudden my flash needs to be updated. Okay. All right. So that takes us up through the return, the rebuilding of the temple. And indeed the temple was rebuilt. It would take a long time before it was the magnificent structure that it was said to have been under the kingdom of Solomon and afterwards. But, and we don't know that it really was because we have no evidence of that particular temple even existing, but I think it did. But at any rate, what follows is a sort of black hole of Jewish history. From the 450s or so, we don't really know a whole lot about what life was like there for this new Jewish community or for this newly reformulated Jewish community. There are some books that were written during that period that we know. Some of them were locally written, some of them were written abroad. The Book of Esther is a very good example. It's a book about Persian Jewry. It doesn't seem to have been written in Israel. It's the only, one of the only books, I think it's the only book in the Bible that actually refers to us as Yehudim, Jews. We do know that there were some other communities that had developed. So where they were, how they were, I can't tell you a lot, but they are attested to by certain extra biblical and extra, well, now we're starting to get out of the period of the Bible, although some of the later books are written during this period, but they are attested to by some extra Jewish works, let's put it that way. There's only one that we really know anything about, and that is a small military colony in the middle of the Nile that seems to have been a Persian Jewish garrison. And then later became a full-fledged Jewish community. We know them from their correspondence and other kinds of things too. But by and large, all we can truly say is that we know of two large Jewish communities, one in Israel and one in Babylon/Persia, them being one polity at the time. And wherever those people traveled, it's really hard for us to know. So we can't really pick up the wanderings until we go back to the one community that really left us a lot of words and a lot of history. And that does become Israel. And you can see how this mythology forms, that everything comes out of Israel, because that's what we're left with here is the Israel-centric. There are reasons for that too that I'll talk about, but mostly it's very easy to tell you why. The other Jewish communities, by and large, with the exception of Babylon and Persia, we don't know when they started and we don't know what happened to them. But whatever happened to them started to happen after the year 333 BCE. I won't embarrass you like I do when people are in person with me and ask everybody to tell me what happened in 333 BCE, but hopefully you know that that's when Alexander the Great swept through Greece and basically every place he could get his claws on and conquered everybody and brought with him Hellenism all over that part of the world, and absolutely to the Jews as well. We all know from high school history and from college history what Hellenism basically consists of. It's not just Greek mythology, it's everything else that the Greeks offered, their entire way of life, up to and including the promise of citizenship, the structures of their cities, the so-called polii, the polises, math, sciences, art that was really, really risque for Jews, kind of a love of, even almost a worship of the human body, all kinds of things that you don't even need to know a lot about traditional Judaism to know that then and now, there's a lot of traditional Jews who are not into that. They were all introduced to it at about the same time all over the world. He made it as far as India, though he didn't wind up staying there. But as you also know, Alexander the Great might have been great in conquests, but he was not so great in lifespan. And this guy was dead at the age of 32, which began an entire new chapter in that part of the world's history, because now, having brought all of this wonderful Hellenistic and challenging Hellenistic culture and mindset with him all over the place, what he now left behind him were warring factions of generals. And those warring factions of generals were included two groups that started their own kingdoms, their own occupational kingdoms, where plenty of the locals became part of who they were. Hellenism was adopted and loved and adapted by almost everywhere it went. There was plenty of resistance. We'll talk about ours in a minute, but it was universally loved in many places as well. It opened up trade. It opened up higher standards of living. It opened up all kinds of things. The two kingdoms that most affected the Jews were the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdoms. Ptolemaic, of course, with a P, this being, a Greek word. So who were they? Well, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter who they were. One was in the north of Israel, one was in the south of Israel, one was Syria-based. We sometimes call them the Greco-Assyrians. One was Egypt-based. We sometimes call them the Greco-Egyptians. And you can already see in your mind's eye who was in the middle. That would be Israel. And so Israel went back and forth, being a very, very important land for trade routes, went back and forth all the time. After all, Africa is connected to Europe, to Asia, and the Near East, and Europe for that matter too, in some ways, although that wasn't important, by Israel. That's that important land mass, land pass that they have there. And the Jews under the various Seleucid and Ptolemaic groups, as long as they gave them the passage peacefully and they paid their taxes, their dues to whichever king was in charge, they more or less got left alone. But over time, kings changed and situations changed, and now pieces of history start to come very, very much into a much clearer relief for us. And these are stories that you've heard of. By the time we hit the mid-2nd century BCE, Hellenism has taken stronghold in Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. And it has taken stronghold among, to a very great extent, the Jewish elites. The Jewish elites like it. The same thing that Rabbi Wein talked about, being a world people. Well, that was very, very much in effect there. They liked the trade. They liked the standards of living. They liked the ability to think differently, to become part of a global world. Jews still tend to have these globalistic ideas, not universally, because we also have groups of Jews that are very narrowly focused. But we do continue repeating these sort of trends throughout our history. Right now, we're very, very much in the middle of one. We have some Jews that are very much focused on the Jews, and we have other Jews that are much more cosmopolitan, much more outward looking, And you see them reflected in your Twitter feed, right? So who does Soros represent versus who does a Netanyahu or someone represent? Those kinds of ideas continued. I don't want to make too much of the comparisons. There is a tendency for us to read too much of our current situation into the past. But if history doesn't repeat itself, as one person once said, who I'll never remember who it was, it does often rhyme. And so I'm of the school of thought of rhyming history. In the mid-2nd century, due to a number of very complicated things that we're not going to get into, the Seleucids found themselves in control, and the Jews, both the elite Jews and others, were vying for all kinds of approval, and other Jews were a little bit ticked off at their globalism and their cosmopolitanism and their desire to sort of smush over differences. What do I mean by that? Well, it doesn't cost anything for a humanist to say that a Greek who says that Zeus represents the infinite power of the universe is exactly the same as a Yahweh who represents the infinite power of the universe. I hear those, well, I don't hear many people talk about Zeus anymore, but I certainly hear liberal Christians talk that way about Jews' God, the Jewish God, and Jews talk that way about the Christian God. I hear Hindus talk that way about their own gods, that these are just manifestations of different pieces of the infinite, of the universe, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when that faction gets control of the temple, and on, I don't know, around December 25th, which is a big day for Zeus, decides to erect a big salute to Zeus in the Jewish temple, you can see how the pietists might get their noses bent out of whack a little bit. And they did, and they revolted, which every time I hear, I think about that scene in Mel Brooks, The Peasants Are Revolting. They certainly are. Well, they were certainly both. In this case, the revolting peasants have come down to us, not so much in my household, but at least throughout Jewish history, as the great heroes whom you've heard known and called the Maccabees. The Maccabees were a minor priestly family that led a big old giant revolt, and they were also part of a larger group of people called Hasidim, not the Hasidim that you know from Brooklyn. That word, by the way, Hasidim, which means like a pietist, we've recycled that for different groups of Jews over the years, none of whom were connected with each other. The current group, I think they may hold the title for having that name the longest, but very different than this group, except in the fact that they tended to be ultra traditionalists. And well, they fought with each other. This is the Hanukkah story, right? The Hanukkah story, of course, is not the story of evil Greco-Assyrians bearing down upon the poor innocent Jews. It is very much more accurately described as a civil war in which one side called in the power of the other, and the power of the other would be the elites calling upon the Greco-Assyrians and Antiochus, and telling some lies, by the way, and some truths about their enemies, pissing off Antiochus to the point where he sent in his own troops, and there you have a battle. And surprisingly, the Maccabees won. They won. And that's why we're lighting 8 candles in just a few weeks. By the way, we're going to be doing that congregation-wide, so those of you who are members are welcome. We're going to do it every night on Zoom, except Friday night when I'll do it on YouTube. So we don't celebrate, at least I don't celebrate the Maccabees as heroes. I don't celebrate any of them as heroes. But if you'd like a little bit more on my take, you could look at last year's winter edition of Humanistic Judaism magazine. Those of you who are members have access to it. And if you don't, I'll write to me, and if you want to read it, I'll get you a link. This year I wrote about something different involving Hanukkah, but it's not relevant right now. They did win. And over time, and it took a little while, they managed to create a third Jewish commonwealth. So we had originally Judah. Well, we had originally had Greater Judah, Israel, then we had Israel and Judah. So that's 2. And then this they call the third Jewish commonwealth. And the current state of Israel is frequently called the fourth Jewish commonwealth by people when they're trying to make these connections. You know, sort of how the French do with their republics, although I think they had 5 or 6 of those, like in a 10-year period anyway. So we waited much longer than the French did. The name of the kingdom that they established was actually based on their family name, which roughly transliterates into English or Greek, Hasmonean. So when you hear about the Hasmonean dynasty that started in the mid-2nd century, there's your Maccabees. No miraculous oil. Sorry, that's a story from 800 years later or 750 years later. And I think that people who are taking a class with a humanistic rabbi anyway wouldn't expect to see it. Well, as Jews do, we cocked that one up pretty big. And within about 90 years, the Hasmonean dynasty was already on its hind legs. It was not doing well. It was getting ready to fold, the big folderino. And so in order to keep the fighting that was going on at a minimum, they made the fateful, I don't know, error perhaps, but certainly fateful decision to invite in none other than the new kid on the block, that great contender from the boot, Rome. And Rome came in and imposed upon Israel the Pax Romana. And the Jews did not live happily ever after. So let's talk about the Jews under Rome. And this is going to be my first attempt with this class to do a share. And here we go, the Jews under Rome. So this, everybody can see this okay? Arthur, you can see if they're nodding. They're all nodding?
No, I can't see anybody.
You can't see anybody. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to assume everybody can see it since Arthur can. And can you see this, Arthur, running around the screen? All right.
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, thanks. So this is roughly the Roman Empire, sort of at its greatest magnification. We can't get into everything. There were plenty of times the Roman Empire had what to do with the Mesopotamian area here. But as you know, the Parthians, the Persians, and so forth, they were always in conflict with somebody over on the left side of your map. But what you're seeing here with these red lines are probably not a bad representation of when and where and how the Jews got around the world. Now, our map incorrectly says Jewish dispersion routes 70 to 300. This started earlier than that, and that's the problem sometimes with going to these various maps. I had to pick the one that was the most representative of places we would be. It also leaves out a few places. For instance, it shows arrows going up here, but it doesn't show that this was, I guess this was only Roman under the Byzantine, so I guess that's okay. But you can see all the different places that the Jews were going. And heavily, the communities of the Jews were focused down here in Northern Africa. A major community began to come into place in the early 1st and 2nd century CE, now on our side of the divide, in North Africa there, and in Alexandria in particular. In fact, we have a lot of information from one person about a different kind of Judaism, a Hellenistic Judaism of their time. That's a couple hundred years after the fight that went on with the Maccabees. But if you've ever heard of this guy, Philo of Alexandria, he tells us a lot about how the Jews, who were perfectly good, loyal Jews, viewed themselves at the time. So Jews are already living in many different places, and we will return to that map in a moment. But first, what I wanted to talk about was how things went downhill pretty fast. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing. And it doesn't help when you're a people who is really grossly unlike a lot of other people. And in fact, anti-Semitism, and in a kind of a modernistic way, did take hold in many of these places. It had a lot to do with the Jews' ongoing refusal, with permission by Rome, by the way. They had full permission to do this, but they also exhibited incredible, well, what should I say, stubbornness in refusing to give homage to the Roman gods or even the Roman emperors when that became a thing. Who had sort of the aura of gods about them, right? They became or were elevated in a way to a godlike status that wasn't that uncommon. And Jews began to get into it with the Romans over a number of issues, both in Israel and outside of Israel. What began not that long after the Jews gave their autonomy over to the Romans, it was kind of a mutual decision. The Romans would probably have taken it anyway, but it was time, was a series of what we call of skirmishes and worse that we call the Jewish-Roman Wars. Now, this is not just one war, and it doesn't just take place in one area. Traditionally, when you learn about these wars, most courses, even and especially a survey course, will focus upon just what happened in Israel, and that was important. But these fights were not limited to Israel. They began around 66 CE, and they continued to about 135 CE. So we've crossed the big Jesus divide, about whom I am going to say nothing, because he is meaningless in Jewish history. Christianity is extraordinarily central to Jewish history, but not Jesus. He was meaningless in Jewish history. He only becomes important with what people did with him. So this was basically a series of large-scale revolts by the Jews of the entire Eastern Mediterranean area. We even know of some that took place in Rome. But primarily Northern Africa, Alexandria, Jerusalem, the Galilee, other places in Israel where Jews lived, even some in Mesopotamia where the Romans were really not in charge, but where they sometimes exercised influence, the Jews primarily on that side being part of the Parthian kingdom, the Babylonian world, which helped us survive, by the way, since we weren't only in Rome. The first of the Jewish wars didn't last very long, but ended in what was probably the most catastrophic event of all the wars. I'll say maybe one of two most catastrophic events, which was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And you can go to Rome today, someday I'd like to do it, and see the Arch of Titus and the carrying away of all of the valuables of the temple, including that big menorah, which if you go to Jerusalem today, you can see a pretty good reconstruction of it in the old city, in the Cardo, as they call it, the recreated Roman marketplace in the Jewish quarter. But the parts that we don't hear about, as I said, are Alexandria, are Cyprus, are places like that. Now, the temple is destroyed, but again, unlike the mythos, this does not lead all the Jews to leave their homeland. Far from it. In fact, the Jews don't view leaving as being something that they're really that interested in doing. Do they scatter around Israel? They do. Do many leave? Certainly. But there are other revolts that continue over the next 40 to 50 years, particularly in the 110s, that take place in some of those areas that I mentioned. And so those being the larger Jewish communities, there was not a rush to leave Israel. In fact, there was a reorganization. And in 132, there was another revolt. This one was catastrophic. And in fact, I call this one really the more catastrophic of the two. Because while the temple's destruction was an enormous cultural blow, those who study Jewish history know that the temple had already become kind of superfluous to most people's lives. Certainly with so many Jews living outside of the land of Israel, it was sort of like Hadassah Hospital. You know, you donated your money and you designated it for the hospital, and that's how you support Israel, right? They didn't agree with the government of Israel, meaning they didn't agree with how the temple was being run. Most people didn't agree with how the temple was being run. And in fact, the largest group of people who didn't agree with how the temple was being run up until 70, when it was gone, were called the rabbis. Well, those same rabbis took over the entire governance of the Jewish project in Israel and beyond right after the destruction of that temple. So that doesn't really seem to have been a big loss for them. That they lost the war that they didn't want anyway. They were peaceniks. They didn't want to get in this war anyway. They were telling everybody not to. But by 132, these rabbis, about whom we're going to speak much more in our next class, these rabbis were supporting this messianic delusional guy named Bar Kosiva. They called him Bar Kochba, the son of the star, of no less a rabbi than Rabbi Akiva, whose name you might recognize because he's on the name of a lot of Jewish schools around the country. He declared this guy the Messiah, and he was not the Messiah. In fact, he got everybody killed. And that was really one of the low points for the Jews in Israel. That's really when Jews left, or, and this may not be an exaggerated number, simply died. There are estimates, and some of these are extra Jewish sources that indicate that there were possibly as many as 1 million Jews who died in Israel at the time. That's a lot of people. And usually I look at these numbers skeptically, but they are repeated in a number of sources, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. And the population, the best that we can guess, we don't really know populations very well because we don't have censuses or any kind of data like that, but it sort of seems that way. So I am going to talk about these rabbis very briefly, because although we're going to spend a lot more time on them in the next lesson, since they essentially invented the Judaism we have, I do want to mention them because they were an important group and they continued to grow. They spread out into Babylon as well. And as I mentioned, ultimately, the Talmud that we have today, the primary, we have 2 Talmuds, but the one that takes up the most space on my bookshelf, or in the Sefaria, no, Jews don't need books anymore. It's all in Sefaria now. If you don't know what that is, if you've ever studied with a rabbi in the last 5 or 10 years, we're getting them all from Sefaria. I cannot believe how much money I wasted on books. But anyway, it's still, they look nice in my office. So Sefaria is a great resource, and you can use it too. Sefaria.org. But anyway, the rabbis, well, they were not a major group. They existed at the time of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty. They started to emerge, but they had been known primarily as the Pharisees, in Hebrew Prushim, meaning the ones who withdrew from everybody else. They were actually populist. Their withdrawing from other people was not about wanting to leave the Jews. It was wanting to leave the shadow of the people running the temple and the Jewish institutions. They weren't even called rabbis until much later. We never call them Pharisees today. Of course, the New Testament kind of hijacked that term. They were, at least in the stories that were written later, they were opponents of Jesus. I don't think any of them even knew Jesus existed, but they come to be known to us as the rabbis long after this. The rabbi means, or it comes from the word rav, like a master of material, sort of like in, teach me, O master, that kind of master. Anyway, they would become the founders of all the Judaisms we have, even humanistic Judaism, because we're working off their template. But as I said before, there had to have been other kinds of Jews, because the rabbis' influence until after the destruction of the temple, and sometime after the destruction of the temple, had not seemed to have spread to Alexandria or Rome or Asia Minor. So what happened to all those Jews? We don't know. We know some of them were probably killed in these uprisings, but by and large, we don't know. The best I can tell you is that they were probably converted to Christianity at some point. That wouldn't be such a surprise. Christianity kind of calls itself the new Judaism, right? The new Israel. So they shared a lot of Hellenistic ideas. They shared a lot of thoughts. It probably was easier for them. It probably was easier politically and in every other way. A lot of Christians had come out of Judaism in the sense that they were admirers of the God of Israel. They just weren't admirers of all the stuff you had to do to get in. Remember in the first class, we talked about the entrance fee for this particular ride on the Jewish Express. For women was high-ish. For men was, are you kidding me? So, here you could get a ticket on the Christian Express, same damn God. Oh, and pork too. And it seems like a lot of Jews might have taken that journey. We just don't know. But in the spirit of the Judaisms, the plural, I have to mention them. What we know about them, as I mentioned earlier from my reference to Alexandria, is mostly preserved in the philosophy of Philo, the great philosopher whom the Jews did not preserve. The monasteries preserved him, because his ideas seemed so, particularly his ideas about metaphor and so forth, the scriptures seemed so unbelievably Christian to them, that, or at least proto-Christian. They knew he wasn't a Christian, that they just loved him, and they essentially saved him. All right, so This is a class that's going to go a little bit longer than the hour. I had mentioned to you at the beginning that there would be some classes that went an hour and 15, even slightly longer, and this is one of them. So the next thing we're going to do is look at our map again and remind ourselves, where did they go? So here's where they went. And it's essentially everywhere. Even up here, which takes us into Eastern Europe. This right here is the famous Crimean Peninsula. They went everywhere. Now, did they go in large numbers? Again, we don't know. When we talk about Ashkenazic Jewry in just a moment, I'll tell you what we think. And the same when it comes to the Jews, particularly of this region, who were so important. But look at, they're in Arabia. They're in Arabia. They're in Egypt still. They're all over the Mediterranean area, into France, into England. Let me see what my next map was. Can I even do this on this? I might have to stop sharing and then reshare. This is what I don't like to do with these maps. Well, I just showed you that one. Okay. Nope, not that one. Okay, I'm not gonna be able to get it, I'm sorry. It doesn't matter, I don't wanna waste any more time on maps. You get the idea where the Jews were. We spread everywhere. So one of the places we spread that's of great and ongoing interest is to Europe. And the area that we primarily seem to have spread into were France, the Rhineland, Alsace-Lorraine, England for sure. We seem to have been there pretty early on with the British. What were these communities like? We don't know. In the first class, I mentioned that what we do know about Ashkenazic Jewry, named because there's a land in the mythical north in the Bible called Ashkenaz, not because it meant anything, but because, you know, you've got a mythical land in the north and now you're there, so you might as well give it that name. So the Jews call it Ashkenaz. But what we do know is that from DNA evidence, there was a small group of Jewish men who apparently intermarried with some Northern European women. And this became the centerpiece or the central genetic line of the European Jews. What did they eventually become? Well, this is a long story told short, but they developed over time their own customs, their own Judaism, but all based upon these rabbinical writings that we'll begin to talk about in 2 sessions, starting with our next lesson. They were heavily influenced by Christendom. We begin to get real writings about them not until the 9th and 10th and 11th century CE. That's when we really begin to learn more and more about this community. For one thing, we find out that under the leadership of one rabbi, Rabbeinu Gershom, who was also known as the Light of the Exile, really the founding rabbi of that community, as far as we know, in terms of any written community or any permanent community, he establishes it. But he makes reference, they all make reference to communities that have been there for hundreds of years. Each of them with the permission of the people that they're with, whether they're originally following the Roman legions up and are itinerant and wandering, or they begin to settle down in what becomes ultimately Christian Europe in the 5th and 6th and 7th century. It's harbored in, it just shadowed by so much lack of light. We just don't really know. But we do know, for instance, that Rabbeinu Gershom, when he finally comes on the scene, one of the most important things he does is he declares Jews must, in Ashkenaz, must become monogamous. That's not something Jews did. But that becomes a big value. Today, you don't know any non-monogamous Jews, but it was Christianity that made us monogamous because we weren't going to have multiple wives while the Christians were around. They were barely tolerating us to begin with. Why did they tolerate us? Well, they certainly threw their share of anti-Semitism at us, but I have a whole lesson on anti-Semitism, so I won't go into that too much. But primarily it's because the Jews were able to fill slots that Christians couldn't. For instance, financing. Financing was a very, very big deal until those banks in Florence began to form, and the rest of, which was a long time after this. The Jews were the ones who could charge interest. They could be in other fields where there was no competition. So in addition to banking, jewelry, shops, later in Eastern Europe, this is much later, they were tavern owners frequently. Wherever we were often doing something that they wouldn't. It wasn't always like that. One of our greatest rabbis there, who lived a little bit after Rabbeinu Gershom, probably to this day considered one of the top 10 most revered rabbis of all time, Rashi, which is an acronym, Jews like their acronyms, for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. He was a vintner in France. And so there were, when these communities were small, it seems that changes began to take place during Rashi's lifetime, because that was the first Crusades, which, you know, united Christendom in Europe in a way that hadn't. Things got very, very bad. And this is a map I am going to show you. At one point for the Jews, even as they were growing, they were also dealing with some of the worst moments in Jewish history. For instance, oh, did I do it again? No, here it is. Okay, did it right that time. Here's all the best places that the Jews got thrown out of. And you can see we're talking about a lot of history here. The Jews left England, were thrown out of England at the end of the 13th century. And they did not return until Cromwell allowed them to come back in. That was almost 500 years. In France, the 14th century, Germany in the 14th and 16th century. Look at all these places the Jews were thrown out. We're leaving this aside for a minute. Where did they go? The prevailing theory is that they went to Lithuania, to Poland, to this whole region here. Now, there were many, many crossings. And even today, as I was preparing this class, I ran into new information that cross-filed weather information and weather patterns with Jewish wanderings. So maybe suggesting that Jews who really were dependent upon other people to make their food, when there were droughts and so forth, needed to go to better places. We just don't have a lot of evidence. We do know they developed their own language. It's a Germanic language. It's called Jewish, but you know it is Yiddish, which means Jewish in Yiddish. My grandfather used to ask me, do you speak Jewish? Like, what are you talking about, Grandpa? Jewish isn't a language. That confused me for years. All right, so we've met some of their notable Jews too. And this being a survey, we got to move on. So let's move on to the Iberian Peninsula and the Arab world and the Ottoman Empire after that. Jews under Islam. The Jews were under Islam since day one. And in fact, Muhammad writes about them. It created some tensions, but it also created some nice relations. And the Jews followed the Arab Muslim conquest all the way across the Near East into Asia Minor again, and ultimately found their greatest moment of glory among the other nations of the earth until that time, when they followed the Muslims to Iberia, to the Iberian Peninsula, Andalusia. Am I saying that right? Under Islam, the Jews, like the Christians, with whom they also had contact, but less, were governed by the Pact of Omar, which essentially said that as long as you guys recognize that you're not as good as us, and you get permission, and you dress in a certain way, et cetera, you know, we'll leave you alone. You can do your own thing. And that was pretty advanced. So they did their own thing. When the Muslims invaded and took Spain in the 8th century, the early 8th century CE, the Jews went along with them. And they brought with them all of these values of sort of a toleration, of a tolerance that, with, you know, obviously some non-modern pieces to it, are still things that we kind of admire to this day. So they instilled the values of statecraft and centralized government, and their toleration even allowed Jews to grow very high in governing bodies. And in fact, you can go through Jewish history of the Iberian Peninsula, of which we have much documentation, and find all kinds of accounts of Jews who grew to great power, including some of the greatest power in the land. This period, and it went on for hundreds of years, was known as the Golden Age. And the Jews did very well under Islam. We know, for instance, from the Cairo Geniza, which is the world's longest running garbage collection of the Jews, of all their papers, we know how the Jews were living. It was a lot better than Europe, and there were also a lot more of them. The European Jewish population, we don't know why exactly it took off, but it is relatively small, owing to the fact that nobody in Europe seemed to have lived past 35, because you couldn't escape dying in childbirth. And if you didn't die in childbirth, you were for sure going to die of the plague. And if you didn't die of the plague or childbirth, you should really, really celebrate, because those two things were pretty rare to get out of. But those things were not necessarily as big a feature of the Jews who were living in the Muslim world. It was a whole different place. Of course, like any golden age, it came to an end. It began to end with, no surprise here, our friends the Christians, when they began to view the necessity of controlling all of Europe. The Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, took off, and of course led to hundreds of years of fighting between the Muslims, one step forward, three steps back all the time. And as, of course, the Christians progressed, the Jews either learned to fit in and adopt sort of a Christian way of looking at the world, as being a Jew, or they left. A lot of the tension was caused by inter-Islamic problems. You know, when you're being conquered from up above, you're going to start, hey, you guys, you're not tough enough on the Christians. We're going to take over and screw the Jews as well. This is what happened, for instance, to Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, one of the greatest Jewish scholars. He's definitely on the top 10, maybe on the top 5, maybe with Rashi on the top 5. Maimonides was born in Cordoba, in Andalusia in 1138. He wrote so much philosophy, he wrote the very first compilation, organized compilation of Jewish law. It's not, it's consulted to this day, it's studied everywhere. His philosophy, a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews don't like so much. But even he had to hit the road. We think of him as a Spanish Jewish scholar, but he had to hit the road. And not long after the Reconquista began to move even further south, there were inter-Arab, inter-Muslim fighting that made a lot of the Jews decide they were going to go to other parts of the Islamic world. And he went, we hear he had a brief sojourn in Israel, but he ultimately settled in Egypt, in Fustat, which is just a part of Cairo, basically, and became the chief physician to the Sultan there, and was and continues to remain of great importance to the Jewish people. So, I did get you out a little bit sooner. So anyway, what we're going to do next time is, all right, since we ended a few minutes earlier, I'm gonna take you up just a tad more. And this is just to point out that I mentioned Ashkenazic Jewry and I didn't mention Sephardic Jewry. Just as that mythical country in the north mentioned in the Bible became associated with Germany, Ashkenaz, the Spanish Peninsula became associated with another mythical country known as Sepharad, which is the modern name for Spain. We actually don't have a modern name for Ashkenaz. We don't call it by, there's no country we refer to as Ashkenaz, but Sepharad is still used in modern Hebrew as the word for Spain. And of course, we all know what happened in 1492. This is, you don't even need a survey course to know this. 1492 was a moment of great disaster when the kingdoms of Spain were finally united and the Reconquista was completed. We find the mother of Catherine of Aragon and her papa too. You never think to make these connections, right? The guy the lady who married King Henry VIII was the kid of Ferdinand and Isabella, the one who sent Columbus over here to kill everybody. I guess that wasn't their instructions, but that's what they had in mind, getting all that gold. And they were the same ones that threw all the Jews out. They told the Jews, you have until, and you won't believe it, but it's true, the 9th of Av, the universal day of Jewish mourning, to convert or leave. Many of them went to Portugal. It was also a problem. Ultimately, they had a little freedom there, but then they were forced to convert, but not allowed to leave. And the diaspora that began, the dispersion of the Jews that began, created a brand new civilization of Jews all over the place, some of which we can trace very easily because it took them, for instance, to modern day Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire, which took them in, generously took them in. It's how we get the language Ladino, which was sort of the cognate of Yiddish. It's a Judeo-Spanish, Ladino being spoken on the Iberian, in Asia Minor in Turkey. But where didn't they go? They established communities or joined existing communities and overwhelmed them with their sheer numbers in Northern Africa, in parts of the Middle East even. And where they didn't go, their influence was so wide due to Maimonides and other great scholars that had for so long had such an imposing presence. But they also came here, not directly, but some did. There were Jews on those ships with Columbus, probably conversos. A lot of Jews died in the Inquisition. The Inquisition was not aimed, as Mel Brooks would have it, at Hasidic Jews who were 600 years away from ever looking like that and about 3,000 miles away from where it happened. It was aimed at conversos, at the many Spanish Jews who stayed and converted, some of them very honestly and very sincerely, and others hoping to remain that way briefly and then leave. Many of them wound up in South America. One of those communities in South America, after it turned over to England and Portugal, and then back to Portugal, England, back to Portugal again, provided us with our first American Jews, when 23 of them in 1654 hopped on a boat to leave Recife, Brazil, and wound up in New Amsterdam. And they were definitely on the lower side. I don't know how far east they were. They did not find corned beef, but they would not have been looking for it because that was not who they were. But they were the first American Jews on the North American continent. Many others went to Spain, went to the Low Countries, particularly Amsterdam. Spinoza, who is a particular hero of humanistic Judaism. We mythologize him a little bit too, but nevertheless, we get our guy. Why doesn't what if everybody else gets their Hillels and their Akivas and their Maimonideses, we want our Spinoza. And he came out of that community in the 17th century. So, and that community continued to be very strong as well. So what happened on that Iberian Peninsula with that particular scattering created another far-flung Jewish community. Sadly, it shrank and shrank over time as the Jewish community of the Ashkenazim grew and grew. And by the 18th, 19th century, the Ashkenazic, primarily now Eastern European, flourishing Jewish community until the 18th century, and then started to head a little bit downhill with the rest of Poland. It wasn't just a Jewish thing. You know what happened in the 18th century, the late 18th century in Poland, when Poland was basically erased from the map. But until then, they continued to grow, and afterwards, they continued to grow until they comprised 90% of the Jews of the world that I mentioned in our very first lesson. So that's where we're going to stop tonight. Next week, we're gonna push rewind, because we're going to go back to the rabbis, and it's not next week, whenever it is. The dates are all on the newsletter. We're going to rewind, and we're going to look at the development of the rabbinical Jewish way of life. We will touch upon, in a very non-chronological way, we will not only talk about what they invented in terms of celebrations and in terms of observance, but we will also hop all over history, looking at what succeeding generations and other geographical groups of Jews did to change these things. So you'll get the big headlines, here's Rosh Hashanah, but then you'll also get the development going back to Babylon, how the rabbis did it, how the Reform Jews did it in New York in the 19th century. So it's going to be much less of a history and much more of a look at what Jews do, what rabbinically based Jews did then and now, with a couple of little excursions into a couple of communities that were never connected to the rabbinical principle thing, who didn't die out. And there's really just a couple. Almost all of them died out. Even the Chinese one, which is so wonderful to talk about, eventually died out. These aren't the Jews of Shanghai, by the way, not those Jews that were Holocaust people who were settled there. I'm talking about in the medieval times. But the Jews of Ethiopia, we'll touch on them briefly. And we will touch on the Jews of India briefly. But primarily, we're going to look at all the Jews we're familiar with and see how all their different Judaisms developed and how their different customs about how to live and what Jewish marriage is, and Jewish divorce, and Hanukkah, and all that kind of stuff. So I will see you guys then. Wish you all a very happy holiday. A couple of minutes if you have questions. Anybody's welcome to stay on, but since it was 8:15, I wanted to give you permission to leave as well. So if you have a question, go ahead and ask. And otherwise, I will see you then.